The first thing Luana noticed when she arrived at St. Helena Asylum was the silence. Not an ordinary silence, but an oppressive kind, as if the very air was full of memories. The building, erected at the beginning of the last century, had a new wing where the residents spent their days, but it was the north wing, the oldest and most disused part, that seemed to watch her, with its dusty windows like vigilant eyes. Luana had accepted the job as a newly qualified nurse without much question. She needed the experience and the salary. The director, a middle-aged man called Dr. Ottavio, was polite, but always seemed nervous, especially when talking about the old structure of the building. He just warned, Asa Norte is closed. There's no reason for you to go there. The first few days were quiet. The residents were quiet elderly people, some with memory problems, but all in need of attention. Luana felt useful. But then, on the nights she was on duty, the silence began to change. On the third night, while making rounds of the corridors, she heard something. It wasn't exactly a sound, but a vibration, a whisper so low that it was more like a sensation than hearing. She stopped, tilting her head, trying to identify the source. The sound seemed to be coming from the direction of the north wing. Intrigued, she approached the large locked door that separated the wings. She put her ear to it and stood there for a few moments until she heard it clearly, a low moan, almost a cry. Her heart raced. "Is anyone there?" she asked. No answer, but the sound stopped abruptly. The next day, she mentioned what had happened to Mrs. Esmeralda, the most lucid resident. The elderly woman closed her eyes and muttered, "Whatever sound you hear, miss, ignore it. They don't like curious people." They? Luana tried to laugh, but the old woman's seriousness unsettled her. The following night, things got worse. While checking the rooms, she saw something strange. One of the wheelchairs was positioned facing the door to the north wing. She clearly remembered leaving it next to the recreation room. Thinking someone was playing a trick, she pushed it back, but the discomfort persisted. At 3 in the morning, the reception clock stopped. Luana was going through papers when the second hand froze. She felt a light breeze pass through her, chilling her spine. And then the whispers came again. This time, louder. They sounded like words, but distorted, like voices underwater. She followed the sounds. The door to Asa Norte was ajar. Luana was sure it had been locked before. Her initial hesitation gave way to curiosity. She grabbed a flashlight and went inside. The air there was colder and had an acrid smell, like mold mixed with something metallic. The walls were covered in dark marks that looked like hands. The flashlight began to fail. She heard footsteps, light, almost imperceptible. She called out, but there was no answer. As she turned down a corridor, she saw a figure in the background. A tall, bent man in old hospital clothes stopped and looked at her. His eyes were not normal, they were two dark, deep, empty wells. Luana stepped back, stumbling over something on the floor, a diary. She picked it up with trembling hands and ran back to the main area. In the rest room, she began to read the diary. It belonged to a former nurse called Clarice, who had worked at Asa Norte before it was closed down. The pages were full of stories about experiments on the residents. Clarice mentioned a doctor, Dr. Almeida, who used the most fragile patients for alternative research. Many died and their bodies were hidden in the walls of Asa Norte. Horror overtook Luana. Before she could close the diary, she heard the sound of something scratching the door. She picked up the diary and tried to leave, but the door wouldn't open. It was as if something invisible was holding her back. The lights flickered, and the voices came again, now almost screams. She ran down the corridor, trying to find another way out, but the asylum looked different, as if the corridors had changed places. At the end of one of them, she saw the tall man again, now closer. He held out his hand and Luana felt an enormous weight on her chest. Unable to breathe, she fainted. When she woke up, she was back in reception, surrounded by paramedics. The director was there, with an expression of pure relief. "You're lucky to have been found," he said. Luana tried to explain what had happened, but no one believed her. A few days later, she handed in her resignation letter and moved away. But the diary stayed with her. And sometimes, at night, she still hears the whispers, as if something had come with her.